Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. We're really glad you're here. And today we've got our friends from Whirlpool with us, as well as from Keystone Solutions Group. And I'm looking forward to talking with them. But first of all, I want to take you to just a little bit of the news. Today, we are going to bring you back to something that we showed last week. And there's some great data coming out now. I'm going to take you over here to this COVID tracking project that we mentioned last week. We didn't really dive into it at all, but we did promise you back when we switched from COVID Connect to MedTech Crossroads that if there was ever any new information that really moved the needle with respect to COVID, we wanted to share it. We wanted to bring that back to your attention. So we're going to take just a minute now, and I want to take you into some of the data from the COVID tracking project. Again, this is put forward by the folks at The Atlantic, and it's a volunteer group that, as they say on their front page here, they felt like no one was, official source was providing the data that we need. And so they went out to make that happen. And it's a really accessible data set. I want to show you a few things out of it today that really struck us when we were looking at it. And I'll just show you how to get there. It's covidtracking.com, our data. And there's a bunch of stuff you can dig into here, which is really great. But if you go to our charts, that's where the really interesting stuff is, at least for what we've been looking at. In the US overall, by region, state comparisons, and then single state metrics. Now, I think a lot of us have been wrestling with, should we be looking at deaths? Should we be looking at cases? Should we be looking at tests? Should we be looking at hospitalizations? And they're all interesting and meaningful. What we've found in our own looking is that the tests and the cases come with a lot of nuance. The deaths, well, that's a meaningful metric, but it may be an underestimate of the impact of the virus. And so hospitalizations, at least for the moment, is the thing that's really caught my attention. And if you look at the US currently hospitalized graph, many of you may have seen a graph like this on the news, which shows the peak that we saw back in April, and now another peak emerging here in July. What's fascinating about covidtracking.com's data is that they allow us to dig deeper by region. And this is the thing we wanted to bring to everyone's attention. There really are regional nuances going on here. I'm not going to interpret it. We're not in a place to say what it means, but I do want you to be aware. If we click on US regions current hospitalizations, what we're going to find is that it's dramatically different. The Northeast had this spike back in April, and those have dramatically dropped off. The Midwest went up right at the beginning of May, and that has for the most part dropped off, although we see a slight uptick. What's responsible for this uptick that you saw on the last page? The South is exploding, and the West is coming on relatively strong. And so this, we felt, gives a more data than we had seen before. You could spend days digging in this site. We hope that if you're interested in this, you do, because we found time and again that what we see reported in the news media doesn't really tell the whole story one way or the other. We're not trying to make one-sided point here, but the data here at COVID Tracking has been really, really helpful. Folks have taken that and they have done cool things with it. We don't get our data from Reddit, but there is a user on Reddit who has posted a GitHub of data from sources like this with visuals created from it. And some of these are really, really interesting, just different ways to visualize how this is happening region by region. Here you can see that the South is largely at the moment responsible for a lot of this increase, but that doesn't change what's happening in the other areas. So I hope you'll find this interesting. I would say start at covidtracking.com. That's the Atlantic's aggregated data source. And since there is this uncertainty, we've all heard that the CDC somehow isn't going to be the first destination for data. Hopefully this will be a useful source. Many cool graphics. This was just a neat one here. I want to credit Steve Minus from our team for bringing this to my attention. You can actually look at how the peak has moved from city to city, and this is by date. Our own fair city of Ann Arbor, Michigan here early in that. and then others coming later as you move down. So you can actually watch the progression of the virus as it travels around. So I hope that's useful to you. I want to always bring those data sets forward when they're available, because we feel like there's so much uncertainty. Folks really need to get into the data. They really need to understand it for themselves and be able to think about this problem holistically. So that's the only news item we're going to bring out today. What I want to do next is I want to welcome our first guests. Today we are joined by Gianni and Phillip Swanson from Whirlpool Corporation. Today they're representing a spin-out of Whirlpool Corporation, which is called WinHealth Labs. Christian as the president and Phil working in advanced development and the innovation lead for WinHealth Labs. I'm going to welcome them to start their audio and video and join me here today. There's
Hi,
Christian.
Gene.
How's it going, Christian?
Very good, thanks. And you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for being with us today. And Phil, it's good to have you as well.
Thanks for having me on today.
So this is really neat. I love the term that you guys came up with, this paper to PAPR, which is just, it's great because Whirlpool, and you'll be telling us about this in a second, tasked you guys with doing something in response to the COVID crisis, and PAPRs are where it landed. We know that when we were talking with nurses, PAPRs were something that everyone really wanted, and I think at some level wants when they're in this uncertain situation to get their hands on. A lot of drawbacks to N95s, and everyone was like, if I could just have this environment that this device was creating for me, this would be a wonderful thing. And you guys really got into it and did the design, did the development, and now have product, which is really cool. So I wondered if maybe we could start and have you guys give us an overview of where you are and what you were tasked with by Whirlpool.
Sure, let's do that. First of all, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So Phil and I are going to give you just a brief journey from that paper to PAPR, as Gene was talking about before. It all started early on in the COVID crisis when our CEO, Mark Bitzer, came to us and said, hey, team, we really need to see what we can do to help out our hospitals. You know, you were just showing us some of the regional numbers, Gene. Early on, Michigan was pretty bad as well. And so he was close to our hospitals here in St. Joseph and also in the state, and realized we needed to jump in and see what we could do. At the time, it was kind of a call for ventilators as well as something more masks and more visors. So we jumped in with the hospitals. I grabbed a few people from our team and we had a chat with them to ask them what they really needed. And it was ventilators and visors and masks. And we felt we could probably make the biggest impact with something that could be an alternate for the masks and visors. Now, we didn't know what a PAPR was at that time, and I suppose that was in some ways a good thing and in other ways a bad thing. It was good because we didn't come in with any preconceived ideas. What we did do, though, was we sat down and we sort of set up a few principles, and the principles were like this. One, it had to be safe, which was obvious. But the second one was we really wanted to make something that did not steal from the supply chain of the existing masks or visors, because we couldn't be as efficient as people who made these all days, every days. So we needed to do something different. And that's why we went down this route that eventually turned out to be a PAPR. The other two things that were necessary for us in our principles was we really wanted to make something that was cost effective. We were going to donate a whole bunch of these. So, obviously we wanted to donate a lot. And we also wanted to make it available to as many people as we could. So we wanted to make it very cost effective. And the last thing was, could we scale it very well? So it's one thing to make a product, it's another thing to be able to make thousands of them. And so those were the principles. And then we started into a true lean development. And I know a lot of people talk about lean development or concurrent engineering, but what that means to me is you get the key players together in all disciplines, mash them together in one team, and make sure they have the right attitude. And that is, how do I make everybody successful here? No one person is the kingpin in the product. Everything needs to work well together, whether that be design, manufacturing, supply, even legal was involved, regulatory, all of those key disciplines needed to be able to meet the needs of the product. And we pulled together a team. We went into a very rapid, iterative kind of design process where we looked at concepts based on what the hospital needed. And, you know, that we pulled in some nurses, some doctors, they became part of our team. And we literally went through concepts, ideation, and validation in very rapid loops. And it started pretty crazy at the beginning. You know, I call it the bits of glue, rubber band, and sticks kind of scenario. And you've got to remember that everybody was locked down at this stage. So that was a real challenge for us. So we discovered Jamboard, a little pitch here for Google, a virtual Jamboard, virtual whiteboard. And we had everybody scratching on the whiteboards all around the place, but together virtually. And we iterated, I think we went through about 9 or 10 design iterations within the first week. And after the first week, we went into the sort of 3D proper model shop type prototyping. And we iterated that multiple times as well. I think we had 4 or 5 iterations of that. And then we built 40 prototype units. And we took those back to the hospital and they used them. And then we went through another bunch of iterations, and then we went to production tooling. That whole cycle took us about 4 or 5 weeks. And then it was off to NIOSH to get approval, because none of the hospitals would touch us without having an FDA approval. So we were really lucky. The government was great with the EUA, the Emergency Usage Act, which basically said, hey, if you get NIOSH approval, we'll give you an FDA approval under the EUA, which was fantastic. And that took us about 2 or 3 weeks to get that. And then we made our first production units at that 7-week milestone. So that was pretty much the kind of technical side of it. And you've got to remember that we have a lot of very deep technical knowledge, a lot of great manufacturing experience, and some great procurement people, but we had zero knowledge of this particular product, and we had zero knowledge of the regulatory conditions for these products. So that was a steep learning curve for us. But everyone pulled together, and we were able to make it happen.
It's really exciting. I know some people would probably be interested to know. So some companies at the beginning were trying to figure out, can we work together if we're working on essential things or remotely? What percentage of like people in a building versus remote were you running to get this done? Because it's just one additional layer of challenge on top of the whole process.
Yeah, that was a huge challenge for us, and it kind of varied through the project, Gene. You know, at most of the time we were separate. We did all of our ideation, brainstorming, and so on remotely. Obviously, we had to get people into the plant to be able to build the physical prototypes. So, and we took the precautions there. You know, the 6 feet distancing, and everyone was wearing masks and visors as we were in the plant doing that. Obviously, we were in the hospitals actually doing the testing with the doctors and nurses. That was kind of scary going into a hot environment like that, and they helped us up by almost their people coming to us in the hospital rather than going into the COVID units. So that was done. And then, of course, the whole manufacturing side was, you know, we had to, we built a factory from nothing to production status in 7 weeks as well.
Wow.
And we took huge precautions on that. And in fact, a lot of the people actually wore the PAPRs when we were first started production. So that was kind of interesting.
Using the thing that you're making right there just for
Absolutely.
protection. That's so cool. You mentioned the NIOSH testing that you did. How did you find that in terms of the backlog? I know a lot of people ran into backlogs with testing labs. And also discovered along the way, I think, that many test labs that can run a test are not necessarily certified to be a pre-test site for NIOSH. What did you encounter there?
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, before we got to the actual testing, we had to really dig through the standard itself. And of course, we didn't have any of the test equipment to even sort of like pre-certify, make sure we were going to send something to them that wasn't going to work. So we built out a lot of our own jigs and fixtures, test equipment in the factory, and tested the product best we could. Our interpretation of the standard before we sent it off to NIOSH. NIOSH were pretty good. The only hiccup we had with NIOSH was there was a bit of a misunderstanding about whether they would test a prototype versus a production unit. And we sent them 3D printed parts to start with, and they did a little bit of testing on them, but they basically said to us, hey guys, we need the full production unit. It was quite good because we did learn something from that pre-production testing. We had some issues that we dealt with because of that, and it would have delayed us had we not had that sort of hiccup, so to speak, right? There's always something good comes out of the bad. But then we flew through the testing on the second time. NIOSH were pretty good. It took us about a week to get in their queue, and it took us about a week and a half to get the testing done, and then there was about another week or so of documentation and so on. So it was pretty smooth, to be honest, considering that testing like that normally takes many, many weeks.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone was trying to accelerate it as best they could under hard circumstances. One of the things that we noticed is just so many people piling in and just doing the best they could. It was very motivating time, I think, for a lot of folks. I want to discuss with you for a minute, Christian, some of the learnings that you came through as a company and as a team. I guess before we go there, really quick, tell us real briefly what you were able to deliver in the end. We're going to talk later about sort of what your next needs are and where you're going from here. But what was the outcome? What did you guys end up with at the end of this process?
So what we have is obviously the product. We've donated many thousands of units now, mainly to hospitals up in the Michigan area, and also we partnered with Dow on the hood to make the material that we needed for the hood, and so we're in the process of donating some more units down into that Texas southern area, Louisiana, and so on. So a bunch of products going to a bunch of nurses. I think the most poignant moment for me in the whole project was when we gave the first 2 production units to the Lakeland Hospital, and Lakeland were our partner at the beginning from the hospital side. And the 2 nurses that received these products literally broke down in tears at being so happy to get this product. Like you said at the beginning, the visors and the masks are not very satisfactory, and as we know, many people at the front lines have got sick through this crisis, and so just to see their reaction was amazing.
Yeah, it's a wonderful thing you're able to do there, and very thankful for all the doctors and nurses who worked through some pretty insane conditions. And unfortunately, right now, what we're seeing in the South, like the data we were just looking at, I won't say once again, but down there, they're now having to go through what their colleagues in the Northeast and in Michigan here had to go through.
Absolutely.
As well.
So coming back to the second part of your question in terms of what were the key learnings? This was almost a model case for us in terms of how to do rapid innovation in a large company, right? And so we've had a lot of discussions since about what can we learn and take back to the company in this. And it's kind of interesting because, by far the most important thing is people, right? And their mindsets and their capability. And interestingly, this team kind of evolved itself. We started with a small core team, and they knew people that they needed, and they pulled them in. And of course, everybody pulled in good people, right? It's interesting how normally teams are assigned by their leaders, their managers, And the lesson there was, hey, let the people who are actually doing the work, the people who really know what needs to be done and really know who the good people are, build the team. And I think that was probably our number one kind of success factor. I'd put this to, right? So that was number one. And the mindset that this team had was amazing. And it comes back to purpose. If people have a clear purpose that they really, really believe in, you can move mountains, right? And, the purpose obviously was to try and help and protect the people at the front line, like you talked about. The pictures of just nurses and doctors with, faces that looked like they'd been destroyed by these masks and so on, wearing them for 24/7. It was a serious motivator for us to try and do something quickly. As I said before, and I mentioned, we had a clear set of design principles, which kind of, when everything went off track, hey guys, let's come back. What are we trying to achieve here? We could have done a hell of a lot more, but our principles were clear and our timing was kind of short. So we had to do the bare minimum to be able to make this work. The other thing was that these people were allocated, and we had two categories of allocation. Hey, you're critical. We need you. You're 80% on the project, so you can't be interrupted by anything else. And then there were the 20% people. Hey, we need you a little bit, but we want you to be available when we need you. And so that worked extremely well. We cut through all the crap associated with budgets in the sense that once we had an original concept and we thought we knew what we'd need, I went to our CEO and said, okay, I need X. And I don't want anyone else to get in the way and second guess it and approve it and all of that kind of stuff that gets in the way. So that was good. It was capped, obviously, so we had to work within it. We weren't given a complete blank sheet, but we were given an allocation that we could use as we saw fit, which we did. And people were very, they were judicious with the budget. And we moved it around as we needed to, which, often in a budget, you put it in a very defined little areas and you go through all sorts of bureaucracy to move it around. We just cut through all of that crap and it worked extremely well. And the other thing is we had complete authority within the project. So we knew what we wanted to achieve. And if we had to do things differently or do things, change our directions or change our approach, we got the team together, we aligned it, we changed it, we moved. We didn't have to go back to anyone else and go through the 5 or 6 questionings around why would we need to do that. And I think that those sort of few things that I've just discussed, I think if we can learn how to apply those into the broader company, I think we could go a lot faster. And it's just a lesson. We didn't cut the corners. We used the processes, but we used the processes to support good people rather than using the processes to stop good people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you think of a large company, and not specifically Whirlpool, but a large company like Whirlpool, you think, okay, this company's it's gonna be good at the long-term quality stuff. It's going to be good at the long-term manufacturing stuff. It's going to have all these big processes and stuff. And you really took your system and pushed it as far back into what we would sort of think of as a startup world as you could. And you pushed way back into that. And it sounds like it actually worked pretty well. Like you guys were adaptable and able to do that. Where do you look at it and you say, you mentioned regulatory was one place that there was no familiarity. What are some places where you look and you say, okay, now we pushed it that far, and here's a place where, if we were ever to do something like this again, we could get even better in this area?
Yeah, I think, as I said before, we had some hiccups with the regulatory. I think, and maybe this was not possible because the team at the NIOSH were just so overwhelmed, I think there's space for these regulatory teams, and they do that. Like we have a great relationship with UL, where you can go in and discuss what you're doing and kind of avoid any pitfalls through their knowledge and bringing it back into ours. We didn't have that luxury on this, but that would be something I would do differently. I think probably there were a few areas that we went faster based on speed versus maybe going to maybe one more iteration on the design. There's a couple of things in the product that could be a little bit better. We've since improved some of them. So maybe you need to make sure you've done enough iterations without overdoing it.
Those are great points because and again, you can't second guess what was done here. This was done under really extreme circumstances and done well from what it looks like. It is interesting though, because I think those things that you mentioned, communication with the folks who are going to be looking at what you're doing, the regulatory or testing bodies, communication and a chance to say, okay, we know we might have to take 2 shots at this goal. Those are really important principles that I think we see over and over again in product development. So it's interesting that those are the 2 you put your finger on there.
Yeah, and one thing I want to touch on too is I think the humility aspect of us, going into a space where we weren't experts starting out, right? None of us had developed a PAPR before, and so we didn't know what we didn't know. So we were constantly asking, maybe stupid questions to our key partners, but then also, standing on the shoulders of giants, right? One of our filter suppliers that we worked with, GVS Filters, had an incredible amount of experience working with NIOSH. So we were able to kind of leverage some of their expertise, especially in the filter design, letting them say, hey, no, we're pretty confident that this is the route that you guys can go, and kind of face the path of least resistance. But again, I do think that was to Christian's point earlier, how did we end up where we ended up? Well, we didn't have a lot of the preconceived notions of what a PAPR should be or could be. But at the same time, we were able to ask a lot of those questions that, because we just didn't know, right? And I think that was a great strength on our side too.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, let me ask you guys this: what's next here? You said you've donated, I think, more than 1,000 of these devices. They're able to be produced now. I think you mentioned, Christian, that WinHealth Labs is a spin out, or I hope maybe I'm getting the terminology wrong, from Whirlpool. What comes next, and where do you go next with this?
Yeah, that's a good question, Gene. So actually, just a point there. We've donated over 2,000 products now.
Oh wow!
Yeah, and the real question is, how do we continue to help? Because the graphs are going the wrong way, right? Everyone was thinking about what happens in wave 2. And really, we're seeing a spike in wave 1, right? And question is, can we be around to help in this area in the coming months, and hopefully not years, but in the coming months? So our next steps are, can we actually start to look at producing these and selling these, again, at a reasonable cost in order to help people be safe and also get back to work, right? You see now some pictures here of people using them in the dental industry. Dental industry has been completely ignored during this COVID crisis, right? And so some of them have been using our devices. And then just making sure that we can really get into more hospitals beyond the local ones that we are dealing with, and seeing if we can get enough orders to be able to make this a sustainable business. We'd hate to be in a situation where we say, okay, we've done our dash now, and then suddenly this thing just keeps on going and we get back into the shortages again that we were seeing before. And I think the other thing too is how can we get our message across that this thing is actually better than a 95 mask and a visor. The nurses find them a lot more comfortable. They feel a little bit safer in the unit because their whole head is covered and so on. If you've worn a mask all day, and I'm sure we all have, it's exhausting. By the time you've drawn the air through that thing all day, had the CO2 build up and so on, it's pretty tired tired at the end of the day. So our challenge now is really, how do we get into the channels? How do we get into the people that need these things? How do we, we made this thing, we supplied it. We haven't got a great big marketing arm that's sort of pushing this, but get the word out to people that we are here. We can make these things if they need them.
It's great to know, and obviously I think there's probably some sense as we watch things exploding in the South. I'm intrigued by whether or not those systems felt prepared. I'm guessing since the refrigerated trucks are coming in, they probably didn't quite feel prepared. And obviously what everyone's watching the data now is, are we going to see things coming back up in the Northeast and the Midwest? But yeah, how to get into those? What is the right way to get into those? We certainly want to get the word out and help you get the word out about what's available and everything else. I will, before I ask you one more question, I want to ask our audience, please raise your hand if you have any questions for Christian and Phil from Whirlpool. We'd love to have your questions as well. A couple hands coming up. But I guess this is something that you've got, Christian. This is available. People can get to this. It's really just a question of connecting people. And this is a great chance for the community. If there's any, whether you're listening to it live or you're listening to it later, if there's any connections that we can make, these are there. And PAPRs, if you were talking to nurses during the beginning of this first wave that hit in April and May, I know here in Michigan, I was talking to nurses and they were like, can I get a PAPR? That's what I really want is a PAPR. How do I get a PAPR? So let's take a couple questions here. I've got Tony Crook, you are live.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
We can hear you just fine, Tony.
You guys did a great presentation. I really enjoyed that. Let me just make mine very brief. So I'm actually doing a healthcare web app as a startup. And so one of the challenges I'm going to have is trying to talk to the doctors and hospitals. I was just curious what's your perception? It sounded like you did a lot of iterations. What was your take on how open and vulnerable were the clinicians as far as this is working, this is not, giving you some good insight. So when you were reiterating, you're able to get things done quickly, or did you have a sense that no, they were kind of guarded and you had to make a lot of assumptions as to how to interpret what they were trying to tell you? What's your take on that versus your expertise in the retail market versus the healthcare market? Just curious your take on that.
Well, let me say, like I said before, we had a couple of nurses and doctors involved at the beginning. The nurses are not backward at coming forward, I tell you that much. They were fantastic and really, really helped us. Helped us with the hospital procedures, helped us with what would work and what wouldn't work. They were very, very vocal about, hey, guys, this is really bad. Do something different. So we were very thankful for that. The doctors, some of them were really good in terms of technical knowledge, and some of them were a little guarded about, hey, is this going to work with FDA? The whole regulatory side that was coming through. That I think was the only side that was a little guarded was, hey, how are we going to get this into the hospital system? How are we going to make sure we don't make our people unsafe and all of that kind of jazz? So we hit that one essentially with data and testing and approvals. Yeah. So they were very, very good at coming forward. Phil, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I'll say that too. One of the constant questions we get as we come into any additional hospital system when we're presenting or sending out samples is around the questions of safety, regulatory, and there's those list of 6 or 7 things that each of the hospital systems want to kind of check off before even thinking about bringing something into the environment. But if you're early on developing and wanting to reach out to a hospital system, there's depending on where you are, Trinity Health in Grand Rapids and then Beaumont on the east side. There's a lot of really great innovation teams. Spectrum has an innovation team as well out of Grand Rapids that do a lot of preclinical work with organizations like yourself or MedTech startups, and to get them guidance or access to certain types of data. May not be real live patient data, but I would exhaust those, or if you want to reach out to me, I can connect you with some of those people so that you can potentially get some feedback on your web app from actual clinicians and doctors that could be experts in that particular area. But it is a tough nut to crack, right? I think we're under these extreme circumstances of, obviously COVID, across the country. it's been a little easier for us to get in because the need is so great and there's so many barriers and bureaucracy that typically kind of get in the way that have been knocked down. But at the same time, you want to approach things the right way. And if you can connect it to the right people, it makes things move that much faster.
It's interesting that you guys mentioned the great experiences you had with the doctors, and I think oftentimes when folks do get connected, you've got practitioners who are just more than willing to share information and get in there and think with you. And then we saw even during people trying to sell things as simple as face shields into hospital systems, and the hospital system would come back and purchasing would have this checklist, and they would go, "Well, is it FDA approved?" And you're like, no, it's under an emergency use authorization. Like, we have this emergency use authorization. It's not going through the normal channels, and the purchasing department hadn't yet learned that they could buy that. It was okay for them to buy that. They were still very much stuck in a not terribly innovative way of thinking. So it's interesting to see those two sides of the hospital system. It's not a monolithic structure. You've got the docs who are willing to work with you, and you've got the purchasing department that's got its own hoops to jump through. Let me bring Ken Spencer on. He had a question here.
Yes, hi Gene, and hi Phillip and Christian. So are you familiar with what the University of Michigan has been doing with a modification to the PAPRs in terms of creating negative pressure PAPRs for that actually create a negative pressure, individualized negative pressure room?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
So we reached out to U of M early on. They have a whole COVID work stream they kind of tried to get into, but I think because they were inundated with so many different products and work streams from across the country, I think the timing just wasn't right. But I guess I'm not aware of any work that they're doing specifically in the PAPR space. I was supporting a disinfection work stream at that time when I was trying to get a connection with them.
Yeah. So several weeks ago, we had a presentation on the at the time it was COVID-19 seminar there that you could probably find on Gene's website there. So the negative pressure, what we essentially do is reverse the PAPR airflow, right? So it now becomes a negative pressure helmet, and that allows us to put that on, as opposed to clinicians, and we can put it on actually COVID-19 patients, right? And that also protects everybody, right? So you can actually have multiple patients in the same room, which you can't do right now. So
okay,
Gene,
good connection for you guys to make. Yeah, we can make sure you guys are connected afterwards if you weren't already. It's a good dialogue to have.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I'd really like to get together with that, because the negative pressure stuff that we're working on, we have really good connections with DOD at this stage, right? Which, we could all probably work together on this stuff. And I guess I have some technical questions on the battery pack there. How long does your battery pack last?
Yeah, our battery, it runs for 12 hours. We spec it at 10 hours continuous use. The battery itself shuts down below a certain voltage. And that takes about 12 hours continuous use.
Okay. And there's just we should make some connections, because we have, and if you could find, I don't know, Gene, can you send them the link to when we made that presentation?
Sure, we'll get you guys all connected up after the show today. Yep.
Yeah, I just found a link on an article talking about the negative pressure helmet too. So I've got some information I can share with Christian after this.
Okay, that's great, because I think we could, really work together on this stuff.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Appreciate that. Ken Spencer, longtime participant here ever since this was COVID Connect 17 weeks ago. Christian, I guess in closing, the kinds of things that the community can do to help you, it sounds like leads into hospital systems, because you got this product sitting there, it's ready to go. Leads into hospital systems. Distributors, or is that something that you guys have your own distribution system, so the distributors are not of interest?
No, distributors are definitely of use, of interest, yep.
Yep, so leads into hospital systems for our friends at Whirlpool, distributors. because we've got a PAPR and we've got COVID coming back up in the south, and we don't know what's going to happen next in the Northeast and the West and in the Midwest. So wonderful effort. Anything else that you'd like to tell us about the effort or your needs, or how the community can reach out and help Whirlpool?
Well, I think, Gene, you know, hospital systems, but also community health, other areas of sort of essential services that need this kind of protection would be valuable as well.
Yeah, we actually just sent out a handful of units to Park, Xerox Park out in California for use. So
okay, that makes me think also of the emergency response teams, ambulances, police, firefighters, things like that. If they're responding to these kind of things.
Absolutely. Yep.
Very good. Well, I can't thank you both enough for being on the show with us today. It's fascinating what you guys did. We applaud the effort. It just sounds like a really great development process. Really stretched you guys as a company and created some amazing things. Definitely want to encourage anyone who's listening today or listening in the replays on YouTube to, if you have connections in health systems, if you have connections in folks who need PAPRs, let's get the word out and let's get these connections made. So Christian and Phil, I really appreciate you being with us today.
Yep, and
Thank you
I
so much.
I did drop my email in the chat. So if anyone wants to reach out, you can send me an email and I'll copy Christian and I on the response.
Awesome. Thank you both today.
Thanks, Gene.
Well, that was wonderful. It's so exciting to see companies doing these sorts of things and being able to really bring these things to bear. It's also impressive when a company can innovate that quickly. So hats off to our friends at Whirlpool. Well, next up, I want to bring on our longtime collaborator, Jim Medsker from Keystone Solutions Group. Jim was part of the original group that when we said, we've got to get the community together, Jim was one of the ones who responded and said, let's get the community together, and email blast. Jim, you can bring your audio and video live. And what we wanted to do today, there's Jim. Good to see you, sir.
How are you?
Doing well. We were so busy talking about development, and I know later on you're going to tell us a little bit about some of how Keystone got involved in the COVID response. But we wanted to back up a step today and reconnect. And number one, first of all, Jim, thank you for being part of getting the word out and convening the community.
Yeah.
It was so exciting to have people all over the state coming together, and appreciate you being a central part of that. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to help.
We wanted to back up a little bit today and have you talk to us, because I know you and I both deal with companies and they say, oh, I just got to go manufacture this idea that I've got. And we'll often, each in our companies, will sit down with them and we'll say, well, okay, we need a design and we need this and we need that. But in talking together, specifically when it comes to manufacturing, I think you have a really unique perspective about what's going to make somebody successful. And this could be a startup or it could be an established company. But there's a lot of questions that you have for them. And I thought it'd be phenomenal to bring you on. And as companies are thinking about, I've got to get to manufacturing, have you walk us through some of the types of questions and thoughts that you have for them that's going to help you make them successful. And I understand you've got a few slides to share with us as well to that end.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Christian and Phil, for that presentation. It's fascinating what you went through with that product development cycle. We've also, Keystone's gone through similar events, I will say, in the last several months with sample collection products. So one of the things I'll preface with the slides I'm going to show is the steps and all the guidelines I'm going to show here are the normal way to do this, although none of us have been living in the normal way recently. So I'm going to go ahead, and it's okay to share the screen. Is that right?
Yes,
Gene?
you should be fine.
Okay. Can everybody see this?
Yeah, you're just fine there.
Okay. So this is, we're going to go through this fairly quickly. Each one of these slides, quite frankly, I could probably spend hours on, but obviously it's Friday afternoon. You probably wouldn't like me to do that. So we're going to go through this. This is sort of a roadmap that we've seen as Keystone has helped folks develop products over the last 20, 25 years in the medical device arena. So we'll jump right in. And one of the three main points here is, the first one is begin with the end in mind. So that's often sort of forgotten. You know, somebody gets excited about an idea, let's run with this. And you kind of have to say, well, wait a minute. What are you going to do? What are you going to be when you grow up? Right? So we're going to talk about that. And then feasibility. Feasibility is often sort of done in a very, very informal way, a very superficial way, again, because the excitement trumps the boring feasibility work that needs to happen. And then we're going to talk about, okay, you've gone through all those hurdles. Now let's get to work. What's that mean? So, okay, begin with the end in mind. You have an idea. So what's next? Well, what's next is, what's your exit strategy? Believe it or not. You want to build bricks and mortar around this thing? You want to create an empire? Or are you more interested in licensing this thing out? Or maybe you're going to flip it. You know, you get it to a certain point and you want it to be acquired. There are others, you know, there's joint ventures, there's strategic alliances, there's distribution agreements, all types of things. So the important key here is the exit strategy drives the development path and your commercialization path. And we're going to touch on that. So I'm going to show you this somewhat busy curve here, but I'm going to go through it. Hopefully, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the lower line, you can see it? Okay. Mm-hmm. So the lower curve there represents your development costs as you go through the different development phases. Now, if we do things right, the upper curve represents the value of the idea at the time. Now, one of the things, we have a lot of entrepreneurs and inventors that come into Keystone at this phase, and we have to diplomatically tell them that their idea doesn't really have a lot of value at this point. But as you go through these phases, the value increases. Now, usually in the early stages, you can attain intellectual property of some type, right? From that vertical line over, you can do one or the other or both. So you can start shopping this thing for sale. You can develop it further and or do both together. So the key is, your biggest value is going to be once you prove that you can actively sell this thing, you can maintain an average sale price, you can get people to write checks for this thing. So we're in Kalamazoo, Michigan. So obviously there's this little medical device company in Kalamazoo called Stryker that some of you may have heard of, trying to make a name for themselves. So we get a lot of entrepreneurs that come in and they have a rough idea, a sketch on a napkin or a 3D printed part. And they think, well, in a couple of weeks, we'd like to walk down the street to Stryker and get a $5 million check for our idea. We have to break their heart and tell them that Stryker and other large OEMs, they don't buy headaches. They buy something that's been through all the gamut, because when they do acquire something, they don't want to leverage their already overburdened quality departments and engineering departments to take it across the goal line. They simply want to leverage their sales resources and push this out to the market. So that's why the value is so much higher when you've actually got this thing through the gamut and into active sales. So let's go through the feasibility checklist real quick. So there's a market check, there's a market checkpoint here: funding, intellectual property, regulatory, technical, and last but definitely not least is the sales channel. So real quick here on the market, a lot of times, and Gene has seen them, I'm sure many of you have seen lots of business plans from inventors and so forth. They often tout the total available market, which is awesome. There's a lot of big markets in medical. However, what's the estimated percent that you're going to take of that market? Who's got it now? Who are you going to take that market piece from? Because you usually don't jump in year 1, year 2, or year 3, and you have 100% of the market. Right? So you got to pressure test that, do some studies. Is this a newer disruptive product, or are you have a play on price? So there's a different strategy there depending on what your approach is. And what are the billing codes for the product? Are there billing codes for the product? Who's going to write a check for this thing? right? So some to-dos there is define the actual problem that the product addresses. Sometimes that's missed as well. And physicians are awesome, but sometimes, especially sort of in the surgical field, their training, their expertise is so specific that they've come up with an idea for a device and they think it's the best thing since sliced bread. But when you look at the total available market, is it really addressing a problem that somebody's going to pay for and replace something that they're already doing? Do voice of customer research. This is often glossed over. And we always tell the entrepreneurs, no offense, but you're the last person we're going to ask if this idea is good or not, right? They're very invested in it. Obviously, they think it's awesome. We got to get out there and get real voice of customer from users, whether it's nurses, doctors, some type of clinicians, what have you. Understanding the barriers to market adoption. You know, is there a big player out there that's just going to squash you? Are there regulatory hurdles? You know, what's out there in the market that's going to be a barrier to your market or to your product? And then establish your sales channel approach, which we'll dive into here in a second. Get my cursor back here. So this last note on this slide is invoking change in the medical market is challenging because change equals risk, right? So the benefit of your idea must far outweigh what's out there today, not just by a little bit, because the resistance to change is pretty great because of the risk involved in changing. So let's talk about funding. You know, first figure out really and be honest with yourself. In fact, add a factor of safety after you're honest with yourself. Total launch costs. Put in some money for marketing, product, and packaging development. Oftentimes packaging development is sort of glossed over as well. Standards testing, IE 60601s, you know, all the outside testing, UL potentially. IP and regulatory, you're going to have costs there. And manufacturing transfer. Manufacturing transfer is often overlooked as well because what that is, okay, so you've done a great job developing this thing. You have a design history file. You've got all the boxes checked with outside testing and inside testing. You still have to get it into a manufacturing environment. And that's a whole series of SOP creations, component specifications, device master records, supplier qualifications. It's a pretty significant effort. Sales and marketing, of course, is important. And then let's not forget, you need initial inventory. You've got to ramp up your production. So what are the typical funding plans that we see from entrepreneurs? First is personal investment. I can tell you if you don't have that as a first bubble, the other investors probably aren't interested. Oftentimes, you know, you can have a little bit of leverage if you go to a pitch, session and say, hey, I've got 1,000 hours invested in that. You'll get a little bit of sympathy, but not a whole lot of sympathy. They really don't care if you spend an hour or 10,000 hours on it.
How much skin in the game here?
What's that?
A little bit of skin in the game here.
Yeah, you got to have skin in the game. The next level is usually the 3 F's, friends, family, and fools, right? And then you go on to banks and other institutions. When you're in the, and every range is different, but let's say sub 1 million to maybe in that million plus range, private equity and angel funding. Venture capital, now you're into the bigger leagues, maybe 2 million up to 10 million or more. Strategic alliances, maybe you can leverage a contract manufacturer or development firm to help you with the launch costs. And plan for delays and contingencies, right? A poorly planned project only takes about 3 times as long as, expected. A well-planned project only takes twice as long. So we touched on the having skin in the game. So intellectual property, is it a crowded field? Can you even attain intellectual property for this thing? Is the idea obvious? Is it warranted to go after a patent? Is this a litigious area? And I can tell you there are a lot of litigious areas when there's big players in that part of the market. Can you even obtain a freedom to operate? That's one thing that's very, very important. You may be infringing on someone else's patent just by launching this thing. So, and that ties in with the other large corporate players in the field. So why would you protect, what's the reason? Why would you protect your idea? Well, protecting the idea is often front of mind when you're applying for a patent, but I always say, remember, there's a cost to defend it. And the last numbers I heard, and they're very dated, is it's $500,000 on average to defend a patent litigation case. So it's great to say, I'm going to protect my idea, but you better be willing to fight for it. It's really also to avoid fraudulent lawsuits. So maybe you don't have a freedom to operate, but you went ahead and get a patent. You can prove that you weren't fraudulent. You didn't purposely go after somebody else's IP. But really that third bullet's the most important. It actually increases the value of your idea. So let's go on to regulatory. Oh, looks like I might have skipped one there. So determine your device classification and get an official opinion letter. I'm sure when I'm talking to Gene, I'm preaching to the choir here. A lot of entrepreneurs come in and they say, well, we believe it's a class 1. So that's great, but for your own protection, hire somebody that's an expert, get a device classification letter. You'll have that in your file. If you ever come under fire in an audit, it's not your opinion, it's an expert's opinion, right? And we don't have to go all through the classes. Obviously, class 1, 2, and 3 is low risk to high risk. And there are different regulatory paths depending on the class. So just to touch on 510Ks though, because they're quite prominent out there in the world, definitely retain a regulatory resource, determine the predicate landscape, find out if a pre-sub meeting is required. Develop your marketing claims, because whatever this thing does or doesn't do, the marketing claims are what they're going to hinge on. If you go to the FDA and say this cures every disease known to man, brace yourself for lots of clinical testing, right? Determine and conduct the necessary testing and prepare for the submission. But I can tell you, if you get your 510K, if it's required and you get it, you can then sell the product. Now, I have more colleagues and friends that have seen a larger jump in their product idea evaluation because of a 510K than a patent. So it's a very valuable thing to have. And then the technical feasibility. Obviously, can this thing even be done? Are the materials out there to support it? Can it be sourced? The components, can they be sourced? There's a lot of technical engineering aspects that need to be considered. Capital investment too, and that should be part of your total funding package as well. That can be very, very steep at times. And what are the lead times? You get into some of these electronics, especially in this current market, there could be a small resistor that's out there that's 6 months out that might hold up your entire program. So a lot of feasible technical feasibility studies need to be done. And now the sales channel, and actually this is kind of the later one, but it's actually probably the most important. And I'm an engineer by education and training. It took me many, many years to do this, or to admit this. But Keystone, as a development and manufacturing firm, we do a lot of really cool, seems like complicated technical stuff, and we do. But quite frankly, all the stuff we do at Keystone is the easy part. This slide right here is the toughest part. Who's going to write a check for this thing? What's the price that it can command? And you have to build a sales staff to push this out into the market. Now, if you decide to go boots on the street methodology, where they're all W-2 employees with base salaries and commissions, that can be very, very expensive, especially for a startup. However, you're going to get 100% of their attention. The other option is independent sales reps. So they sort of eat what they kill, right? That's commission only. Could be a rep firm. You could be part of their line card, for example. Now you're going to get attention share there, right? So you better have a very exciting product that can really fill their coffers with cash if you're going to get more of their attention. You could also do a combination of that. But I will tell you, the days of an individual walking in and kicking the door into the hospital and selling a widget are pretty much over. You just don't do that anymore. Really get to know things in terms like GPOs and IDNs and distribution channels, because that's how things get into the market primarily. Now, COVID has changed that a little bit because everything's so urgent and in demand. I can guarantee you there's a lot of GPO contracts being violated right now, but there are urgent needs in the market, and so they're meeting those. The other thing to keep in mind too with your product is the price point. So every hospital sort of has a different value assessment team that sort of analyzes a new product. It may fall under a capital purchase. Let's say an MRI machine, right? That's going to be a capital decision. Or there's a procedural purchase, and there are dollar limits for each one of those, and there are approval timeframes that vary depending whether it's capital or procedural. So, and this just reiterates of all the challenges getting it launched, you know, getting a successful sales channel is the largest of all. Now, again, you don't have to worry about this if you're just going to flip it right away, or you're going to license it off to somebody that has a sales channel. I like this slide here. It's the day in the life of an entrepreneur. It's a great graph. I've shared it with many. And if any of you have been down this road, and whether you're in a big company or a startup, this happens, right? This is the cycle of product launch. 1 minute you're feeling elated, the next minute you're feeling like dirt, right? So hopefully the last data point there is where you end up, right? So it is a roller coaster ride for sure, and we always coach our entrepreneurs on that. So now let's get to work. The thing's feasible, everything checks out, we've done our homework, and I won't dive into this super deep, but you know, every development firm has its own steps, whether it's a 4-step process, 5-step process, 6 or whatever. At Keystone, we have discover, define, develop, and deliver. So it walks you right through the entire process from start to finish. So that's about it. I just have a couple slides on for some ancillary thoughts here, a note on quality systems. So again, depending on your path, you may or may not need a quality system, right? Depending on what you want to be determines the scope of your quality system. So you could be what the FDA considers a specification developer, where you own the IP and the sales channel, but you outsource everything. So that's quality system light, right? If you're going to be a full-blown OEM, that's quality system heavy. So you've got a big lift there. So that's something to consider when you're going down this path as well. And then build a team. I can't stress this enough. You cannot do this all by yourself. And quite frankly, if you're in the fundraising mode and you're trying to do this all by yourself, the credibility of your mission is going to suffer. You need to go into fundraising things with people at your side, like Gene and his team, or, you know, others that are like a CMO that's a physician. You know, you've got to surround yourself with people that are smarter than you. That'll increase your chances of success for fundraising and launching the product. So build a team of advisors, experts, contract resources. Maybe you can afford to hire a few employees at the start. And then for each checklist step that we went through today, definitely engage experts wherever you can. So you're broke, you're a startup, you have no money. How are you going to compensate these people? A lot of times there's consulting fees that maybe you can stomach to a certain extent. A lot of times you can offer equity and phantom stock. You know, that's a double-edged sword. Seems easy at first, but then you turn this thing into $1 billion enterprise, then you're sort of remorseful that you offered stock, right? Sometimes you can gain some traction with exclusive agreements as well. So in summary, you know, making it all happen, just to reiterate, do the feasibility and dive deep into it. So market, funding, intellectual property, regulatory, technical, and sales. Make a go, no-go decision, employ the proven process, and enjoy your success. So, and then you can reap the rewards, right? I mean, what's this really all about? Hopefully, is patient outcomes, right? That's the first and foremost. Let's improve patient outcomes. And hopefully along with that, it results in financial success for you and all of your stakeholders. And it gives you something to build upon. Once you've done it once and you can wash, rinse, repeat, right? You can get that flywheel going and really gain some traction there. So that is the spiel.
Jim, that's great. I appreciate that. I think one of the things that's interesting, I know when you and I talked before, and then you mentioned it in this presentation, this question of, for an entrepreneur, someone coming with a new product to build, and they're coming and they're saying, I need someone to manufacture this for me. I think they might be a little taken aback by the question, are you trying to build an empire, or are you trying to license it? And they're likely to go, if they haven't been through this before, they're likely to go, why do you care? You're my manufacturer. You shouldn't care about things like that. And this whole list of things you've given, here we are, two engineers sitting here talking about things like intellectual property and regulatory, and nominally the question is, I need to manufacture product. Can you give us just a couple of anecdotes? And I guess it doesn't matter whether it's in the IP space or the regulatory space or whatever, where it really does come down to ground. Link that for us between the actual manufacturing process where somebody thinks, oh, you can just build this for me, and you're going, no, because, and give us an example there of, be it any of those categories we talked about, where they have to make some kind of a decision that they might not have made yet.
Yeah, I could go on and on and on. I think we've launched over 650 programs in the last 2 decades. And one of the phrases I use when we're kind of going through our pitch and our presentation is, I feel one of the most valuable services that Keystone offers is, at times we have to diplomatically tell the entrepreneur that their baby is ugly, right? And what do we mean by that? And what's interesting is a double-edged sword is 3D printing and the accessibility of CAD and finite element analysis. All these tools are awesome. But what they've also enabled is people to come up with a physical thing that they'll come in and set on the table. And in their impression, their perception is they're done, right? Other than, there's some fine tuning that needs to be done to get it in manufacturing. And we sort of have to diplomatically say, you only just begun, right? And we had an entrepreneur once with their personal checkbook in the conference room, open with pen in hand, and say, no, we really want to engage you right now to launch this thing. And we basically told them, we don't really want to steal your money. Because of our tribal knowledge in the last 2 decades, we can often flush out, and don't get me wrong, we want to grow Keystone. We want to engage clients, effectively, but we also first and foremost put our partner and advisor hat on, because it doesn't do anyone any favors if we go down a path when some of those initial checkpoints don't flush out at all. There could be regulatory hurdles that are insurmountable, right? Maybe it's not a 510K. Maybe this thing's heading towards a class 3 PMA, which just drove the budget from $500,000 to $5 million, and drove the timeline from 1 year to 10 years because of clinical trials or what have you. There could be an intellectual property land or a minefield out there as well. So there's a lot of examples where they, especially today, we can leverage really cool technology to make prototypes very, very quickly. And that's awesome, and it's needed, and it's great. But it also can create some false perceptions when it really comes down to, when is the product real, when is it manufacturable, and when can we sell it out in the field? I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, it's great. I mean, your example of CAD and 3D printing is a great example, because folks will often come and say, well, I'm ready to build this, and they've actually done a great job making a first cut of what could this look like, and I've got some ideas, and I've thought through some of the issues, but oftentimes a lot of the deeper things that I know you'll deal with as well, like the moldability of the part or something like that, may not have gotten put in there. And of course, now that we can do things so quickly on a computer and with a 3D printer, we think, the person who's going to sit there and engineer it and draft, it's no longer needed because I can do it right here. Well, what you're missing is all the, like you said, the tribal knowledge, or the embedded knowledge that's brought to bear at that point. So I think that's an appropriate example, as well as the regulatory changes that can come down the pike.
Yeah, we had a client that came to us. They were attempting to launch an imaging product that was actually an implant. And they had been trying to launch it, get it through the FDA on their own for 6 years. And they actually had 3 rejection letters. They came to us, and we partnered with our regulatory resources. And long story short, through really a modification of marketing claims and a little bit of additional testing, we were able to get this permanent lifetime implant approved as a 510K Class 2 device. So that's the importance, going back to hiring the experts for sure. And also back to the importance of marketing claims. Marketing claims are everything, right? And there's always a battle. The sales and marketing folks want you to claim everything there is, right? That this thing can sing and dance and cure diseases. Your internal regulatory folks want you to say, well, it really doesn't do all that. And there's a balancing act. I often tell the entrepreneurs, if you have 2 meetings on the same day, and the first one's with your patent attorney, the second one in the afternoon is with your regulatory attorney. The first one goes like this. You talk to your patent attorney and you tell him, man, this is the coolest thing we've ever seen in our lives. It's the best thing since sliced bread. Nobody's ever done it. And then that patent attorney goes off and does his or her work. You're meeting in the afternoon with your regulatory consultant. You kind of put the stuff on the table and say, there's really nothing to see here. This isn't that unique. Look, there's 20 other devices just like it. You know, it's kind of this, I'm exaggerating obviously for a fact, but that's kind of the road that it takes. On one hand, you want to gain unique IP. On the other hand, you've got to be careful from the regulatory side.
Yeah, I know in our practice, we talk about balancing almost like a compass rose with 4 points on it. You got the technical possibilities and the regulatory possibilities, the market possibilities, and the intellectual property. And they all center around this idea of claims. And what you say kind of has to balance in the center, because all of those are pulling you in different directions. So I couldn't agree more, Jim. That's a great point. Well, I'm going to give just a minute and see if anyone has any questions for Jim and Keystone Solutions Group. This is a great overview you gave. And again, to anyone who goes, what, you know, I thought we were talking about manufacturing issues. We are talking about manufacturing issues. All these things come back down to the bottom of, are you ready to build your product? And so that's a great overview, Jim. Let's see, we'll take one quick look here for questions. Jim, what's Keystone up to these days? I know that you were getting into some swabs and other things, and maybe you can share with us just a little bit about what you've been up to during COVID.
Yeah, sure. So as you know, in general, we're a contract manufacturer, and we produce products in the wound care arena, diagnostic devices, and imaging products of various kinds. Since COVID, we've also expanded into sample collection products. So to your point, we are packaging and sterilizing a wide variety of sample collection swabs. We also provide sample collection vials, and currently with the phosphate buffered saline 3 ml fill. We're looking at what we call the UTM, VTM style vials as well, which is a universal transport media versus just the saline. And we're also now soon in the next couple of weeks launching complete sample collection kits. So we have done a number of face shields as well. We started out doing that. I've been a board member on the local Goodwill here in Kalamazoo for almost a decade, and sort of have led their contract services committee. So a lot of folks don't realize Goodwill does contract manufacturing. They do all kinds of things in addition to the stores and donations and things. And they had and have a lot of employees that were not laid off, but fairly idle. They have an ISO 13485 manufacturing facility in Kalamazoo. So we handed off all of the face shield manufacturing to Goodwill. So we can still sell them through Keystone. They sell them through the stores. They sell them internally to the other Goodwill organizations. So we did start out making face shields, but we handed that off to Goodwill.
Yeah, well, certainly appreciate all the things that we saw you guys doing during that time. There was a lot of irons in the fire, and sort of like our friends at Whirlpool. It's over time those things sort out, and you find where they fit.
Sure. Thank you.
Let me ask you one more quick question, Jim, and again, maybe not your or my domain exactly, but you did touch on it, and I think it's a really important point. I want to re-highlight it. You said for a company to learn, how they're going to sell it. This also touches back to what Christian and Phil were talking about earlier. Group purchasing organizations and hospitals and other entities that actually make those purchasing decisions. From your travels, do you have any thoughts, best practices for getting in touch with groups like that?
That's a tough one.
That's a tough one.
Tough
Yeah,
one.
I agree. And again,
So,
not to say that that's the domain that you do, but I just thought if you can reflect for a minute on
yeah,
that.
you can go through the normal channels. You know, they have websites and they have supplier, you know, their standard forms, and you'll get a response email that says, thank you for your submission. We'll get back to you on the 12th of Never. It's about networking and contacts. And what's interesting about this whole sales channel, and what's interesting as well, Keystone for most of its life has been a contract manufacturer. I will say we're starting to launch our own products now. So we're actually probably in the last year or so, we're learning more and more about GPOs and IDNs ourselves. When you're launching a significant product, what's interesting and crazy is you have to come at it from both sides. So you still try to do some tactical work through the hospitals themselves, but you also have to have the GPO contract. So if you land GPO contracts, that helps your case with the different health networks. And what makes it even more interesting is a lot of the larger hospital groups are basically acting like their own GPO. So I think somebody mentioned Trinity earlier. Trinity is one of them. And in medical, the whole sales channel is very convoluted and strange and weird. And that's why I say it's the toughest part of the whole, scenario of launching a product. So you have to learn how to sort of navigate into not only the hospital groups, but also the GPOs, and have both. Because having a GPO contract is what we call having the license to hunt. You don't get a PO out of it per se, but now you have the license to hunt.
You just got in the door when you're talking to them finally.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, there are a few ways to, I don't want to use the word circumvent, but to, I guess, sort of bypass the whole GPO thing. And that is, one, you can go in with what they call the new technology tract. So when you think of a GPO contract, a certain contract may have hundreds of products on it, ranging from booties to gloves to gowns to safety equipment, sample collection swabs, you name it, blood collection vials, all kinds of things. And if the hospital buys from a supplier that's not their GPO contract, they can get fined, they can lose their preferred pricing, all these kinds of things. If your product is considered new technology, and they have criteria for that, you're free. You're free from the GPO constraints. So that's one route to go. That's really the main route to go if you're going to avoid the GPO sort of scenarios that can constrain some of your sales efforts.
Well, it's really important for people to know that that's there, and to be aware to start looking for it, because it's definitely something in these last number of years that, like you said, the days of just going and selling direct to the hospital are pretty well over.
Right.
Jim Medsker, Keystone Solutions Group, thank you for being with us today and sharing your wisdom. And we really appreciate having you on. Looking forward to the next time we can cross paths here on MedTech Crossroads.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. Well, and we're just going to give 1 minute. We're a little bit over time here. We're going to give 1 minute for any questions, answers, community check-ins that folks have. Feel free to raise your hand really quick. We're going to give about 30 seconds to do that, as we always do. We don't ever want this to be just us talking. If there's something that you need to ask and you want to come on here and ask it, or something you want to let the community know, you are always welcome here. And I'll give another 10 seconds for that. Raise your hand if you have anything you want to add or ask. Beyond that, we are so grateful to have you here with us. We'll look forward to next week, next Friday at 2 p.m. for the next episode of MedTech Crossroads. Thanks so much for being with us today. Goodbye.